Hello, welcome to a wintry Priory Paddock. At this time of the year, the paddock, in keeping with the countryside all around it, looks pretty bleak and bare. But even now, if you look around, you can see some signs of continuing life. Behind the wall at the bottom of the paddock, the gorse bushes have got blossom on them. My granny always used to say kissing was in season whilst the gorse was in flower. The point being that, of course, there is one in Britain which can be found flowering all through the year. On the wall, just inside the gateway, there are some tufts of a small green plant with tripartite leaves, very much like domestic strawberry leaves, but much smaller. And this is barren strawberry, and it has little white flowers. And if you look closely, you'll probably be able to find some of these little white flowers. Sadly, they never actually bear strawberries. And a little further along, to the base of the wall, you'll find reasonably large oval-shaped leaves, usually with deep seams on them and rather lumpy surfaces. This is alkanet. In the spring, that will go into a much bigger plant, and it will produce tall spikes of bright blue flowers, which will carry on flowering right through the year into the autumn. At this time of year, there's one family of plants here in the paddock which I've very often overlooked during the rest of the year, but which become relatively obvious, and these are ferns. The ferns are a very, very old family of plants. Most of the plants around you are trees and flowering plants, and they're in geological terms, quite a recent development. The ferns, on the other hand, are much older. The family was flourishing during the Carboniferous age, that's about 250 million years ago, where they had members which grew as big as trees do nowadays. And the remains of those plants form a very large part of the coal measures beneath our feet today. On the wall, you can probably see a very nice display of ferns at this time of the year. There is one with pointed leaves with lots of little leaflets sticking out at each side. At some point in the past, people thought that this must have looked a bit like a creature of some sort, a centipede or caterpillar, with a pointed head and lots of rounded feet sticking out on either side, because the name of this plant is polypody, which is Latin for many feet. Also on the wall and near the polypody, but much smaller, there's a small leafed plant with tight curling leaves close to the wall called spleenwort. I suppose at some time it has some kind of medical use. Spleenwort is its official name, but where I come from, the old country name for it was maidenhair, for a very obvious reason. At this time of the year, the leaves have cleared from all the trees, and most fruit and berries that were on the trees and bushes have gone. Most have been eaten by birds and those that have fallen to the ground by the mice. There's probably a few left. Probably a few late berries on the hawthorn trees that will towards the end of the winter. The soft growth, the grasses and flowers, no matter how tall they got, have all died and dried out and withered completely now, but we leave them standing to provide both shelter and food for birds and small creatures during the winter, and they will be cleared towards the end of the winter. The very tall codlin and cream plants in the block in the centre of the paddock provide a lot of food. Their feathery seeds of feathery seeds are very popular with seed-eating birds, mainly the finches, goldfinches, chaffinches, greenfinches, as are the teasel plants. The spiky heads of the teasels are probably best known as food of goldfinches. But those aren't the only tall plants which provide good feeding for the small birds, especially towards in the earlier part of the winter where they're trying to feed up. And two that we have here are the tall spires of the purple loosestrife and the rather thistle-like heads of knapweed. At this time of the year, when the leaves are down from the trees and bushes, it's probably easier to see birds in here than it is at any other time of the year. The resident birds include wrens. There's usually a pair of wrens in the marsh area by the boardwalk. We have a robin, we have blackbirds, wood pigeon, and very often a thrush. Sometimes one can find a thrush's anvil, where the thrush has hunted out the snail from amongst the vegetation and broken the shells open on a convenient stone. Residents, we have various birds which visit on migration or being peripatetic, moving around the countryside during the autumn and winter. And two that are notable here are the long-tailed tits, sometimes called bottle tits because of the shape of their nests, little pink and white birds with long, very long tails. They can be seen flitting amongst the trees at different times of the winter, and if you're very lucky, you might catch sight of a goldcrest or two. They also move around during the winter, and they, like the long-tailed tits, can be seen hunting amongst the branches and twigs of the trees and ivy in the shelter belt, looking for tiny insects and spiders to keep them going. And the goldcrest is a very interesting little bird. It's the smallest British bird. They look like a small greenish wren. But the distinguishing feature is that down the crown of their head there is a bright yellow stripe. The natural cycle of the year has reached its lowest point now, but it never stands still. It's permanently turning, and that can be seen clearly in the upper part of the paddock, particularly in the area under the trees. Leaves are down from the trees. The sunlight can penetrate to the ground beneath. So this provides a niche which has been colonised by plants that take advantage of this otherwise unavailable piece of ground. And they grow during the winter. Their leaves start to sprout now. They are in full growth by the early part of the spring when they flower and they set seed, feed themselves up again because they have either bulbs or corms under the ground to keep them going through the rest of the year. And then as the leaves start to open on the trees and the sunlight ceases to reach the ground beneath, these plants die off and wait again until next year. And under the trees at the moment, I can see the sword-shaped dark green leaves in clumps, which will be bluebells, and the tiny heart-shaped leaves, darkish green, speckled with white dots, of the lesser celandine, which will have beautiful bright yellow flowers on it, a bit like a buttercup, but many-petalled. And the very shield-shaped spotted leaves of the wild arum, the wild lily. And on the ivy itself, which grows profusely on the walls here and provides lots of shelter for birds and insects over the winter, the ivy berries. As the winter draws on, those ivy berries will ripen off, and towards the end of the winter, they will provide very welcome food for the birds. Well, that's what we can see in the paddock at the moment. Why don't you come back in a month or so's time and see how it's changed? Cheerio.